Hi, I'm Ted Pattison from Critical Path Training. In this video, we're going to talk about creating SharePoint 2010 workflows with Visual Studio 2010 and the new SharePoint tools. So when we look at what's new in the workflow architecture of SharePoint 2010, first of all, I now have new workflow targets. In the previous version of SharePoint, every single workflow that you would create had to be created on a list item or a document. So now we have the flexibility of creating workflow instances at the site level. And when I create one of those workflows, well, it's not associated with a list instance. It can work on list instances, but there's just a large number of designs where it was unnatural to have to attach the workflow to a particular list instance. Visual Studio is also going to make it easier for me to add in initiation forms and association forms because we have a new SPI for those. We're going to see there are a couple new events that you can tap into that fire every time a workflow is started or ends. And there's also some new support with external data exchange interfaces to make it so a SharePoint workflow can interact with other systems across the network. Now, let's say that I want to create a workflow and there was just no natural part of my design to create that workflow and attach it to a list item. So now we can create workflows that are site-based workflows. And if we look at the XML file on the right-hand side of the screen, well, now you can see that there's a new association category inside of a workflow element, inside of your elements.xml file, and the workflow can be targeted at the site level. Also, as I create a workflow inside of Visual Studio, I am able to add workflow association forms and initiation forms to that. Okay. Now, also there's workflow events. Now, workflows can have code behind them, but let's say I have a list and my list has 3 different types of workflow. Well, let's say that I want to run some piece of code anytime a workflow starts. So there wasn't a very straight ahead way to do that in SharePoint 2007. But now I can simply create an SP workflow event receiver and attach this to a site, to a list, or to a content type. And so there's a workflow starting event that I can have that will execute my code, and there's also another event when the workflow ends that I can tap into. Now, there's also some great support inside of SharePoint for when we need to interact with external systems. Now, let me quickly explain what the problem was in SharePoint 2007. Because of the low-level nature of how workflows run inside of SharePoint, you can't write a piece of code that executes outside of the workflow environment, simply enter and call a method. It had to go through a very special set of channels as it went inside there, and for all practical purposes, there was no way to do that in SharePoint 2007. So we have a scenario where another system or application across the network knows that a workflow has been put to sleep and it needs to wake it back up. So the trick I used in 2007 was to leverage the fact that a SharePoint workflow could be put to sleep waiting on a list item to change. And so what I would do is I'd put the workflow to sleep waiting for an item to change, and then there would be a call from across the network. I'd have a web service entry point and the code there would go and change the list item just so I could get the workflow to wake up and continue executing. But now with these new pluggable services that we have, we can simply use 2 different activities that come out of the box with Windows Workflow, the call external system and wait for notification, so that I can make outbound calls, and then that outbound call can basically put the workflow to sleep, and then as a call comes back and goes through this other activity, which basically is waiting for input, it can automatically tell SharePoint, I need to wake up a workflow instance. It's able to find the correlation information to pull that workflow instance out of the database and resume its execution. So as far as being able to integrate SharePoint with external systems, this is a really nice step forward. Okay, now let's go ahead and just see a demo of creating a very simple workflow in SharePoint 2010. Okay, so here on my development workstation, I've created a very simple blank site. And what we're going to do is we're going to start up Visual Studio 2010, and we're going to create a new project. Now, when I create a new project, I'm going to create a SharePoint project, and I could create a sequential workflow project, or I could create a state machine workflow project, but that really isn't necessary. I'm just going to create a regular empty project just to show I can just add workflow templates as SPIs. So we'll just call this Ted's Workflow Project 01. And as we create this, note that it's allowing me to choose sandbox solution or farm solution. And what's important to note is you cannot add workflow templates to a sandbox solution. If I had picked the sequential workflow project or the state machine workflow project, sandbox solutions would be disabled because you can't put those in sandbox solutions. Likewise, if I pick sandbox solutions, I wouldn't be able to add a workflow template to it and have it function properly. So now that we've created this project, let's go ahead and notice that there are no features at this point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a new item, and I am going to add a sequential workflow, and I'll just call this workflow 1. But as we go ahead and add this in, you notice that Visual Studio interacts with the site. And it basically is asking me, do you want to create a list workflow or a site workflow? Well, let's go ahead and create a site workflow. What's the name of our workflow? I'll go ahead and just call this workflow 1. And it's asking me, would I like Visual Studio to program against the site and create the association for me? Now, I could go and create the association by hand for my testing. It's just Visual Studio kind of makes it a little bit easier. Note that this wizard does require that the site you're programming against already has a history list and already has a task list. So you could simply go through the browser and create a workflow and a typical list if those aren't there to get those created. Now, let's go to the next step. Note that if you are building a workflow on a list, you give the workflow template administrator the ability to say the user can start this manually, or every time a new item is added to the list, I want a workflow to kick off automatically. When you create workflows at the site level, they can't automatically start. They have to be kicked off manually. So now let's go ahead and choose Finish. Notice that in addition to Visual Studio adding a new SPI for Workflow 1 that has the CS and the elements, it also added a new feature. It had to add a new feature because it needs a site collection scope feature to basically take the elements.xml file and add that in. If I look at the elements.xml file, note that it has all the important things, including the association category of site. Now, if I look at the workflow program, well, one thing I note is that we automatically have a workflow activity called onWorkflow activated as our first activity. If I just want to do something very simple, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the SharePoint activities, and I'm going to find log to history, and I'll simply put this in place right here. Now that we've done that, if I just want to do something very simple, I'll click on this activity, and we'll say hello, and we'll say world. And without further ado, let's just go ahead and deploy this. Let's go down here, and we'll choose Deploy. And as I choose Deploy, if I go and I take a look at my output window, what we should see is that it's going through the process of building a solution package, installing it, and then activating that feature inside of the target site collection and creating the association. And so after this runs, let's go to our output window and just see what it's telling us. And as I go through here and I take a look at my output window, I see that it was able to go through there and build everything just fine. Okay, now let's go back to the site. Let's go back to our site, and down below here we'll look at site workflows. And as I go to site workflows, what we should see is that the new workflow template that I created should be there. And let's go ahead and execute it. We'll just run an instance of it. So now this runs, and it runs and takes me back to the main page. But if I want to see what happened, let's go back here, go back to Site Workflows. I can see an instance of Workflow 1 ran. And if I click here to drill down on this page, I can see that it says Hello World. Okay, all well and good. Let's just make one more modification. Let's go back to our workflow program. And one of the things that's common as we create workflows is we use data binding. Let's go back to history description. Instead of hard coding in Hello World, I'm going to go ahead and click on the dialog that allows me to take this and change this into a bindable field or property. Likewise, I'll go to history outcome, and I'll go ahead and create a new member, which is also going to be a field. This one will be called history outcome, and I'll bind to this as well. So now that I've bound to those two properties, let's right click and choose to generate an event handler behind this. Now note that if I take history description and I can say something such as hello, and then I can take history outcome and I can say world, well, nothing would change here except that here inside the event handler I'm initializing these two fields that are then pushed into that log to history list activity, which then do its work. We'll note that there's already some other data binding that was here before I got in and started doing my work. The template added this field called workflow properties. And as that first activity runs, it initializes that. And now what's neat about this is that I can say workflow properties, and note that here is an object that's available for the lifetime of the workflow, and it's always going to give me all kinds of contextual information. For instance, in this case right here, my workflow is running at the site level. So here is the SP web object, or the site the workflow is based on. And there's an URL property. So let's go back here and say something like workflow running on. And then we'll put the URL inside there. And then maybe we'll say workflow ID equals. And once again, we'll look at the workflow properties, and we'll look at the workflow ID, which is a GUID, which I'll bounce to a string. So now that I've made these simple changes and I've added those changes inside here, once again, let's look at our output window. We'll come up here and we'll do a deploy. And what's going to happen is it's going to retract the solution package and deploy the new one, which is going to make it easy for me just to go and refresh the browser and test what I've done inside here. So now let's go ahead and test our work. I'm going to go ahead and just refresh the browser. One of the things that Visual Studio did is it bounced the IIS worker process. So it's going to take just a second for it to initialize the SharePoint worker process. But now that it's done that, we'll drop this down and we'll look at site workflows. And in this case right here, we'll go ahead and we'll run this. And after we ran this right here, let's go back to site workflows and let's drill down on what happened. And you can see workflow running on, and it basically put the GUID inside there. And workflow ID, and there's the GUID of the workflow. So just to recap, I built this workflow template using Visual Studio. And one of the things that you should see compared to the last version of Visual Studio is that it automatically builds your project into a solution package, which makes it so that we know how to deploy into production, and it makes it much easier and more accurate to test and debug your workflows. Also, you saw that I created a workflow which targeted the site, which is also something that we couldn't have done with SharePoint 2007.